Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton.
In this week's episode, alongside guest historian James Taub, we begin an exciting new miniseries, a deep dive into the story of the French army on the Western Front in the Great War. Well, hello Dan, hello James. A pleasure to be joining you on the podcast today. And finally, it's taken us a long time, it's taken us over a year, but finally we are turning our full attentions to, in many ways, the most important Allied army on the Western Front in the First World War, the French army. And listeners, we know, we've heard you, you've written to us many times asking for a lot more content on the French army. We decided we needed to bring in an outside expert for this, because although Dan and I were strong on aspects of the First World War, I'd be the first to admit I'm not the strongest on the French army, and it's great to actually have three of us here to discuss this today, Dan.
Yeah, it's really exciting, Spence, and as you were describing it there, I felt this kind of daunting sense coming across as we were talking about finally getting to grips with the story of the French army in the Great War. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that, actually. The first one, really, is it's an absolutely, in English at least, absolutely underrepresented part of the story of the Great War on the Western Front. Totally overlooked by most English-speaking historians, and it really doesn't deserve to be, because it's certainly in 1914 is the biggest part of the story. It's telling the story of the war on the Western Front by only focusing on less than 25% of the actual Western Front. And of course, the story of the French is absolutely pivotal to the early part of the war and of course throughout the Great War as well. So exciting, daunting prospect, I think, but one that's long overdue. And, it's great to have James joining us here, who's going to, I think, be able to provide that kind of granular detail that really allows us to dig down into the story and understand it from that French perspective. Because as well, James, it's not just one perspective when we're talking about the French army in the Great War, because France in 1914, just to start us off, isn't one homogenous nation in the sense that we think of it today, is it?
No, well, I'll say it's great to be here. And of course, what better way to discuss the French army than by bringing in someone from Michigan to do it. But you're exactly right. The French army of 1914 and the French army before World War I and all the way through is a large body with a lot of different views. It's a mass conscript army throughout this time period. And because of that, it's going to be bringing in soldiers from across the country, some of whom will definitely call themselves French, but come from a wide variety of backgrounds, which is something you guys have referenced previously on the podcast. You can have regiments that come, of course, from Paris, which today is now really what we consider the core French identity. But, for example, you have regiments coming from the Southwest. The 18th Infantry Regiment is one that I've worked quite a bit about, and I'll be bringing up through the series. They're from Pau in the southwest of France, so right along that border with the Pyrenees, with Spain. So they'll have a lot of Catalan speakers, some Basque speakers, and for them, they're as far from Paris as you can get in the country. Likewise, you'll have soldiers from Brittany, who French, again, might not be their first language. They might be speaking Breton. And it's a very, very diverse group. And all of a sudden, they're going to be forced to meet each other and call themselves French soldiers and get this one general French identity of a soldier and of an army that we now consider today.
That's really interesting about the different aspects of the French nation as it comes together in its army. And as you were saying that, I almost had a vision of there's some comparisons that can be made here to the American Expeditionary Force and drawing soldiers from a very diverse nation, but probably not the same comparison can be made in Britain, because although there are clear differences in British regions, particularly Scotland, Ireland, the very southwest of England and so forth, differences of speech pattern and accent and so forth. There's definitely a much stronger national identity within the British Army, I think, there. And of course, the fact the British Army is voluntary as well, that you are you volunteer your time, you go in, you accept that you're going to be part of this army, you're subject to this discipline. Whereas the French army, of course, is a conscript army. You have to perform your national service. Is there an element of nation building about national service to try and smooth out some of these regional differences?
Well, I think that gets us right into the heart of the pre-war French army and the experience of the French military and military service all the way from 1872, recovering from the end of the Franco-Prussian War, into the First World War. And that is part of the idea, is to create this unified French identity. At the end of the Franco-Prussian War, France is entering the Third Republic, and that is the government which will carry France into and through the First World War. And that is a very much a part of that idea, both blending class lines, making sure that folks can't necessarily purchase their way out of their military service, but also to try to promote a general French identity. And I think it's very interesting, comparison to, say, the American Expeditionary Force, but also the British military. Having lived in both Norwich and Glasgow, boy, does it feel like I'm in two very, very different countries. But that carries over with the French community at the time, of course, much less connected than we are today. And military service is part of the way the government is trying to promote that general French identity. And I don't know, Dan, if you've got any other specific ideas about ways, you having spent quite a bit of time in France as well, the differences that might carry over.
Well, I think language is absolutely fundamental to understanding this particular question because, as you rightly said, there are numerous different languages, over a dozen spoken in France in the years prior to the First World War. And not just languages that are really on the fringes, but in certain parts of the country, they're absolutely spoken as the everyday dialect. And so Occitan being one, Languedoc, various others, as you said, Basque and Catalan French being different to Catalan Spanish, as well as, of course, French as we understand it today. But it's worth pointing out that there are units that pass each other on the march that are unable to communicate, certainly at the other ranks level. All officers, we should say, are required to speak French. And this is, I think, by the time we get to 1918, really quite a unifying factor. In fact, you could really argue that the Great War starts to eradicate those regional dialects that today in France largely don't exist anymore. But I want to just bring this back, and I think there's a good point here because not everybody understands the basics of the French military. Certainly, we can get into the detail, particularly around conscription and those kind of various elements at the moment. But let's just bring it back for a second down to the basics. And I wonder if before we get into a bit of the myth busting, which is inevitably associated with the story of the French in the Great War, let's go right back to 1815. And just because there are two or three kind of major mile markers I think we need to address in order to understand the story of the French in the Great War. One of them is the Napoleonic Wars, or the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And then we've got two other major conflicts that are worth considering here. One of them being the Crimean War, and the second one, I think the elephant in the room at this point, is going to be the Franco-Prussian War. All three of those, James, are absolutely vital to understanding the story and the idea of French military tradition prior to the Great War, because it's very, very strong, way stronger than we think it is.
Absolutely. And I think, starting in 1815 is really the way to go, because it busts one of the first myths that I think a lot of folks have in any sort of English-speaking, French-speaking world about the First World War, which is there was a century of peace between the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 and the outbreak of war in August of 1914. And looking at a basic history of France and the French military, you can tell that's not quite true. So beginning in 1815 with the fall of Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo, France returns to a monarchy. And very quickly, the French army goes on campaigns again. They intervene in Spain. They intervene in Greece during the Greek Revolution. So they are quickly trying to reestablish themselves on the world stage, and that will continue into the Second Empire under Napoleon III, Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew, as he gets involved in the Crimean War, where the British Army has some great quotes about it, interacting with the French Army as an ally now in the 1850s, and also adventures into Algeria, the colonization of Algeria, as well as other parts of Africa and East Asia. an intervention in Mexico, which is contemporaneous with the American Civil War. Here in the United States, we celebrate Cinco de Mayo every year, and many don't know that's the anniversary of the Mexican defeat of the French army. And then as well, of course, the elephant in the room, which is the Franco-Prussian War, which is a large wake-up call, ends the Second Empire, begins the Third Republic. It is a relatively quick war, 1817 to 1871, and Paris is surrounded. People inside the city are eating animals from the zoo, and France is completely destroyed. And this is going to be the generation of young men who will end up being leaders of the First World War, which immediately kind of brings you into that mindset. And, you know, Spence, as a expert on sort of the late 19th century warfare, I'm not sure, can you probably enlighten us a little bit more on just how much the Franco-Prussian War affects military thinkers in between the end of that war and the beginning of the First World War?
Absolutely. It is a bombshell. It's a bombshell militarily. It's a bombshell politically. It's important, listeners, to understand that how revolutionary the Franco-Prussian War is, not just in its military effects, but in its long-term ripple effects. A number of things have happened very, very quickly that have never happened before in living memory. So an entirely new, very large, very powerful, very prosperous nation state, Germany, has now appeared in the center of Europe. And it has crushed what has up to this point been the cultural and, in many ways, economic leader of continental Europe in a matter of months, inflicted a total defeat upon France. And it's been done so quickly, it feels like a revolution. And in many ways, it is revolutionary. The German organization, their efficiency, their use of logistics, their use of rail transport, it's recognized across Europe that this indicates a change in the nature of war. In fact, the Franco-Prussian War is so influential in Britain, it spawns an entirely new and now almost completely forgotten genre of literature, which we call invasion literature. The very first of these is a series of short stories initially, later a short novel called The Battle of Dorking by a Royal Engineer officer called George Chesney. And the Battle of Dorking, it's told from the perspective of a battered veteran who is telling young children about what happened when, although Germany isn't explicitly named, what happens when Germany invades Britain. And this is really a book about the Franco-Prussian War because it's contrasting the old traditional ways, British ways, against this new frightening system of German military efficiency and economic and scientific efficiency. And it all happens so quickly. There's no real precedent for this in European history. Every army now scrambles to try and either find a way to counter the Germans or mimic the Germans. And that's true across Europe. Britain, of course, slightly different approach and naval power, but nevertheless, there's huge debates in Britain about, well, what do we do? How are we going to fight like the Germans? How are we going to mimic them? It really shakes everything up. And also, of course, it shakes up the balance of power in Europe. Whereas previously, Britain has been the dominant world empire, France has been the dominant continental power. Now you suddenly have this new upstart, highly aggressive, highly militarized power. And it's important to remember, listeners, that in the 1860s and 70s, Germany has been born from war, from the Prusso-Danish War, from the Prusso-Austrian War, from the Franco-Prussian War. And its deeper traditions going right back to the time of Frederick the Great are all anchored in it as a military power. And so you've got this aggressive upstart power that is unbalanced all of Central Europe, surrounded by, in many cases, weaker powers or smaller powers. And of course, you've got this other problem, and this is that the French and the Germans end the war, the Franco-Prussian War, with the German decision to annex a big chunk of eastern France, and that's Alsace-Lorraine. And this becomes such a political problem within Europe and will continue to be a political sore point right up until the First World War.
There's a couple of really good points you make in that there, Spence, I think. And I think the one thing that we need to establish here is that bitter taste is still in the mouth of French troops as the outbreak of the First World War goes along. And a big part of that, as you say, is the annexation of a large part and an important industrial part, we should say, of France. So that is really going to be one of the backdrops to the story and is actually going to play a part, particularly in 1914, when we look at how aggressive the French army is going to be in responding to those initial German moves. So, I mean, it's interesting as we've kind of moved closer to the 20th century here. It's interesting to see how France went from, of course, in 1815, utterly defeated imperial power, albeit one that has seen significant success in the years before that, to eventually becoming an ally of the Brits and taking part in a true expeditionary war in terms of the Crimea, and then further expeditions, as Jim said, in Mexico and Italy and various other locations, to having this fight now on their home soil in the Franco-Prussian War. And how did that experience, James, to your mind at least, shape the way that French military thinking in between the end of the Franco-Prussian War and the start of the First World War? How does that evolve? And what exactly is the French army thinking in terms of its next big fight? How are we going to fight it? How are we going to conduct it? And what lessons can be drawn from the Franco-Prussian War?
Absolutely. And I mean, I think it's a great question. And I think one of the best ways to talk about it is first culturally. In the 1840s through to the 1870s, and in large part because of the memory of the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon I Wars, as well as Napoleon III Wars, the French military is considered the preeminent land force, as you mentioned, in the Western world, to the point that other militaries are emulating them. During the American Civil War, the basic tactical drill manual for a regiment was the French chasseur à pied manual, directly translated, a light infantry manual. Soldiers on both sides are famously wearing what they even call kepis, which is just the French word for hat. And by the mid-1870s, the United States Army has switched from a French-style kepi to a spiked helmet, interestingly, as part of their uniform. So culturally, the French military has watched themselves go to a second-tier force in the face of this unified German military. France approaches this, and the French military approaches this both on the drawing board in terms of the battles to come, but also, as all nations do, they look at it diplomatically. They see German expansion and look at the successes of German expansion and see that Germany only really succeeded in places where they could diplomatically isolate their opponent. So the Prussian-Austrian War in 1866, the various wars against Denmark, and then the Franco-Prussian War as well. France was standing alone, hoping and expecting Britain to become involved, and it just doesn't happen, similar to the Danes in the 1860s. So at the diplomatic table, they form alliances, and they form alliances with belligerents that they know Germany is eventually going to run into, and the big key one is Russia. They know that if Germany enters war with France or they enter war with Russia, the other will come to each other's aid, forcing Germany now to fight a two-front war. Something that no Western power in this day and age would do is enter a war without allies. And this is a lesson learned in the late 19th century. They also originally go on to this idea of the defense will bring us victory. We'll get to the elan and the assault later on, but the generation which experienced the Franco-Prussian War saw French infantry crushed by German cavalry, Mars-Latour. I know this is something that came up in your cavalry episode as well earlier, and completely outmaneuvered. So establishing, and this might ring true with people who study the Second World War, establishing a chain of forts is one of the first efforts the French military undertakes in the Serre de Rivière system, building these impressive modern fortresses along the new border to defend from German incursions, and beginning to mass conscript in a way in which the Second Empire would not be able to achieve. And it goes into this idea that France has had historically of the levée en masse experience during the French Revolution, but really making the nation prepared for a war logistically, diplomatically, and militarily. And it kind of, as a comparison, I know most of our listeners here come from the Anglophone world. Dr. Jones, is this kind of something that the British are experiencing as well at this time? Is this something that the British are thinking about, or are the threats different?
I think the threats are very different in Britain, despite what I just mentioned about the booming and continuous interest in invasion literature, in which Germany is nearly always the villain, although not exclusively the villain. And listeners, I really can't get across to you enough how influential and important British invasion novels are. They really run from 1870 right up until the outbreak of the First World War. And a lot of them have this common theme of the threat of a much more efficient Germany overcoming this sort of weary, old-fashioned, traditionalist Britain. And of course, it's echoing what seems to have happened to the French. But in terms of military preparedness, Britain's primarily interested in colonial security. Its army is, above all else, a colonial expeditionary force. British Army fights some sort of war somewhere in the empire every single year of the reign of Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901, except 1862, when the army or the nation nearly goes to war with the Union over the Trent Affair in the American Civil War. So the army's always focused on involvement with the empire until after the Boer War, really. And then gradually Britain begins to change its attitude because of a sense of isolation. And you made a great point, James, about the need for allies in European politics post-1870. Britain finds in the Boer War it has no allies. It's deeply isolated. There's even fear there's going to be intervention against Britain while it's locked in South Africa by European powers. And from that point on, it begins to seek allies. Japan to start with, to balance the risk of Russia. And the growing sense that there's serious hostility coming from the continent, especially from Germany, where Germany's instituted a naval arms race against Britain, beginning in the late 1890s and continuing until the First World War. A huge strategic misstep for Germany, one of the most foolish decisions that the German government made. A naval race they could never hope to win. And it was designed as a deterrent towards Britain, but all it did, of course, was actually push Britain into the arms of other continental powers. And it's this combination of the British feeling isolated and needing some sort of continental security, and the looming threat from Germany, which has gone from theoretical in the 1870s and 1880s to actual by the early 1900s because of Germany's naval building program, that starts to bring Britain and France together. But very typical of British diplomacy in this period, Britain is not interested in signing a formal alliance with France. And that's going to lead instead to this, in many ways, revolutionary from a British perspective. But I wonder how much the French felt they got out of this. And this is the Entente Cordiale of 1904. So in Britain, this is seen as an interesting break in foreign policy, an important break, a friendly understanding with France about really initially, I think, dividing colonial spheres of influence and smoothing out some colonial frictions. But it's the beginning of the Anglo-French alliance that will, of course, be a pivotal part in the First World War. But how's it viewed in France, James? What does the French government want out of this connection with Britain, and what does it expect from it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's absolutely fascinating because it almost is at loggerheads with one another. You've got this hope that Britain will come to France's aid in the event of another war, which everyone knows is coming, another war with Germany. But there's never the expectation. As we get into the 1914 campaign, the French aren't quite sure the British Expeditionary Force is going to show up until they do. So they'll place them in the most convenient spot and expect them to be on their left flank, which we'll get to, and you've covered in the Mons episodes. But there is that hope, but then there's also still that era of competition, and that brings us into the French Empire and this era of competition that, Lord Kitchener, famous British commander, one of the last experiences he has as a commander in the field is the Fashoda crisis, and dealing with a French general who will end up becoming a divisional commander in the First World War, General Marchand, leading French colonial troops into Sudan. So there is still these potential flashpoints, even in the years leading up to the signing of the Entente Cordiale, which could break into open war. And for France, the French Empire is very much a prestige movement, much more than economic, unlike the British Empire. It is about holding that place among the great powers of the world and trying to really catch up to what Britain had accomplished colonially in the 18th and early 19th century, what France had lost largely to Britain in the 18th and early 19th centuries as well. So the French are going to always have those flashpoints with Britain, but the hope is that everything can sort of be overlooked as war on the continent begins. So there is that constant, okay, I think we're friends now kind of feel about the British going into it. But definitely there's some flashpoints that come up, the Boer War even being one, something that I know you guys are both students of. The French worship the Boers, seeing them as somewhat of freedom fighters, to the point that the French army even considers adopting a uniform called the tenue Boer, the Boer uniform, kind of based off of what these farmers down in South Africa are wearing as they fight the British army. So it is very much a back and forth. Oh, we need you now. Now we're enemies sort of relationship. And I think there is a lot more research that could be done on this, but there's never the thought that we are 100% guaranteed for Britain to come in and help us. There is a much larger hope in France, and I believe in Britain, that they'll come. But as the French Empire and the French metropolitan world prepares for a war, the question of Britain is one that is looming.
There's a couple of interesting points you make there, James, and I think that the point about empire is very important, from both the situation really in the wider political world and also from the situation as it's going to develop on the battlefield as the Great War really kicks off in earnest. I think one thing to point out here is that Britain, whilst it may be willing to make deals with foreign powers, it's always a little bit skeptical about making deals with a foreign power that also has its own interest in empire. And there's that kind of side-eye kind of effect that you can imagine the Brits making. They're always a little bit wary of somebody who's got influence in the same parts of the world that they're interested in. So they make slightly uncomfortable bedfellows in that sense. But as you say, throughout history, my enemy's enemy can be my friend. There's a little bit of that as well, I think, as far as the French go. But they can also, much like Britain can do, the French can draw on their empire. In fact, are going to draw on their empire, and they're going to play a huge part, particularly in 1915, but also slightly earlier in the war. But for the listeners just listening in right now who want to know a little bit more about what kind of troops are we going to see rallying to the national French colours once war is declared, where do they hail from, what do they look like, and how do they compare against the French national army?
So it is really important to look at the French military in the understanding that, similar to regiments of the British Army that kind of view themselves as different organizations and come together to form the British Army with their own traditions and identities, the French military is much more Republican, much more unified in the sense of, I'm an infantry officer, I'm an artillery officer, versus I am an officer of the 1st Infantry Regiment or the 2nd Infantry Regiment, though they do have their own traditions. But on a larger scale, you've got two armies. You have the Metropolitan Army, that being the army serving and raised among French citizens in France, and you have the Colonial Army. The Metropolitan Army, famous red-trousered infantrymen raised in the cities of Paris, all of that. But the reason I mention them in terms of talking about this overall colonial service as well is because you have soldiers that, and enters one of these myths we have long called French colonials, but are considered by the French to be metropolitan troops, and those are going to be the troops from France's North African colonies. The French consider Algeria as a department of France, as a part of France, 3 departments within Algeria. And those soldiers are known as Zouaves if they're of European citizenship, or tirailleurs if they aren't, are going to make up a key part of the French military planning, mainly because these are the guys who are going to be used in France's wars in North Africa in the decades prior to the First World War. But then you've got the colonial troops as well. And these could include the European-based colonial infantry regiments. So Frenchmen who sign up, traditionally members of the Navy, but in the decades before the First World War are shifted over to the Army and can be sent anywhere in the world to serve, particularly in the colonies in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as in East Asia, Indochina, what we now call Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia as well. And then you have the locally raised forces, a bit different than how the British operate, specifically in India, but thought much more scientific and sort of racist thoughts about what nations can serve, how they can serve, similar to the British in India. So you have Senegalese troops, and the French will use the term Senegalese to describe anyone from West Africa. So it's important to note that we could be discussing a tirailleur, which means like a sharpshooter or a skirmisher. Tirailleur Senegalese, who could actually be from Chad, could be from Mali, but the overarching term at the time was Senegalese. You also have soldiers from French Indochina. Most of them will be used as labor troops during the First World War, though a few battalions will see action. And you have even troops from Madagascar, as well as French Polynesia in the Pacific. The French system of colonial service is really focused on these soldiers serving within their own spheres. So Senegalese troops are expected to serve primarily within West Africa, though the thought of them serving throughout the rest of Africa, and even some who end up in East Asia, isn't a foregone conclusion. They could still end up out there. During the war itself, it will be the first major time that these soldiers will end up serving on the European continent. And as we'll see, there's a lot of debate about how to use them. Could they handle European weather was one of the major concerns. Could they be trusted among European citizens? Would they learn too much and ask for more liberties and rights at the end of the war? So it is something that France is going to really have to struggle with, and goes into the French mindset of what is French and what is not French. The soldiers coming from the colonies are serving France but are not French, whereas soldiers from North Africa, particularly the European citizens, as I mentioned, serving in regiments like the Zouaves, are French. They just happen to live in French Algeria, which is part of France. So it is very, very confusing. You have soldiers from French Algeria who are considered not French, the tirailleurs, because in many ways the French Republic, using this idea of religion not being part of any part of the French government in terms of Republican values, will say, well, Islam is incompatible with the ideals of French republicanism. Therefore, you have to swear that French republicanism is more important to you than your religious texts. So many of these Muslim soldiers won't be considered French citizens, but are going to be living in, again, a department of France in Algeria, whether that be Oran, Constantine, or Batna. So a real divisive and also something that isn't very straightforward as compared to, say, I don't know, either of you might be able to speak more about, say, the British Indian Army and how they organize that as a separate force to the British regular army.
I think that's an interesting point, that the empires that exist, Germany has an empire, but it's too small to really draw troops from, whereas obviously Britain and France have overseas empires. One of the big questions, of course, that is prominent in the British military mind is the reliability of the Indian Army, or let's not forget the Indian Mutiny of the 1850s had been an army mutiny. And really from that point onwards, the British Army had kept the Indian Army a step behind the regular British Army in terms of its technology, just in case there was another mutiny, that it would be easier to suppress this than it had been in the 1850s. Now, that attitude had begun to change by the 1890s and certainly into the 1900s, not least because Britain was thinking more and more about, well, what can the Indian Army do in the event of a major European war? But one thing that just struck me about your discussion there, James, is that the French had an immediate vision of using their imperial troops in a way, these are international non-white troops, in a way that the British Empire perhaps didn't. But on the other hand, the British Empire had a a distinct difference from the French in that there were several large countries, the Dominions, Canada, Newfoundland, South Africa, New Zealand, and Australia, that were predominantly white, English-speaking, and were expected to provide troops too. So interesting comparison, I think, between two imperial armies that are nevertheless very distinct and very different. And I think this is an important thing to remember, that although Britain and France will be allies throughout the First World War, and indeed the Second, culturally and politically, they're really quite different in many key respects, especially, I think, in the early 20th century. Their differences become less, I think, as time goes by. But in the early 20th century, they are very distinctly different. Different empires, different nations, and crucially as well, different political outlooks. And I have to bring this up because one thing I think is very easy to forget about as a British military historian studying the British Army is British Army, it has its ups and downs with the British government. It has battles over funding. There's a famous incident in March 1914, the Curragh incident in Ireland, where some British Army officers say, we will not fire on Irish citizens or Northern Irish citizens. That at the time is quite controversial. But compared to some of the political, civil, military relations problems in France at the time, this is minor stuff. And I have to ask you, James, about the Dreyfus affair and the effect that this had on French civil military relations and indeed French preparations for the war. So briefly, for those listeners who might not be familiar with it, could you outline the Dreyfus affair and its impact?
I think this is the perfect point, as you mentioned, Spence, to discuss how the French military interacts with the French government. The Dreyfus Affair comes about in the late 1890s, early 1900s, as a result of an officer known as Alfred Dreyfus, who is an artillery officer serving in metropolitan France. And his star is very much on the rise. He is considered a very successful student, has gone through all of the artillery schools, is accused of sending classified French documents to the German ambassador and therefore in through Berlin. He is very quickly tried by military court and sent off. The circumstances of his arrest, the circumstances of the evidence are always suspect, and they make it out into the public. Some of the officers fighting for his defense quickly say there's a lot of issues here. One of the key points of evidence being his signature matching very closely the signature of the alleged spy handing over documents, working under a pseudonym to the Germans, and is banished, sent to a deserted island, treated horribly under military guard. And it very quickly turns out that the French army had bungled the investigation. It very quickly turns out that there was a very large aspect of anti-Semitism. Dreyfus was a Jewish officer that played into this, and French public opinion is immediately divided between the more liberal side, which supports Dreyfus, saying he is innocent, as well as the more conservative, established French army and that political body in France as well, saying he's guilty. Eventually, after years of retrials, after him being found guilty multiple other times, it turns out that it was not him. It was another officer named Esterhazy, who is a member of an established French noble family, who is a conservative as well. And Dreyfus is eventually freed. Eventually, him and his sons all serve in the French army with distinction, all in the artillery, in the First World War. So this creates this massive, massive scandal in France. This is where you get famous French articles that are on par with many of the editorials we hold dear in British or American history as exposing public opinion, like j'accuse. It's basically saying I accuse the French government of conspiring to make this man a guilty officer, even though they know he's innocent. So that opens up this massive rift in French society. Before this, there had been a lot of struggles between the Third Republic and the established French military leadership. Again, it's very traditional, very conservative, comes out of the French Second Empire, where class had much to do with being promoted. And it makes it so that to obtain success in the French military in the wake of this affair, you have to politically be on the side of the government and also be politically on the side of whichever party is in charge of the government at the time. We're going to see the rapid rise of soldiers whose names we will encounter again once we get to the War of Sale again, such as Maurice Sarret or Joseph Joffre, who are considered to be truly Republicans to the core. Others who really probably are hiding their true political views as well as their views on religion, like Ferdinand Foch, who are able to cover that and put the profession first so that the government can overlook their personal views, as compared to, say, officers such as de Castelnau, who will end up being an army commander, who is an outspoken conservative, practicing Catholic, who will be at odds with the government in the wake of this affair. So the politics in the French army go hand in hand down to who is being named as regimental commanders, all the way up into who is being named the general-in-chief of the French army. And because of this Dreyfus affair, as well as several other minor scandals which break out in France, the government going into the First World War is going to be a left-leaning one. It is going to be one that is favoring Republican values over traditional conservative values. And that is going to bring a whole change of mindset as well to how the French army is going to operate on the battlefield as well, how the French army is going to organize itself in the years leading up to the First World War. And really, really a difficult system.
It's really interesting points that you've made there. And I think as we've been kind of creeping our way towards the proverbial storm clouds gathering over Europe in 1914, and as we get to the end of this episode, actually, it brings us, I think, to a great point where we can just set out the stall for what's to follow. Because, of course, now we're going to be getting into the story of the Great War as it's fought on the battlefields of Europe. But before we do that, James, and to leave us for this part of the episode at least, can we just set out really quickly what exactly the French army looks like in 1914? Who's it composed of? What kind of size is it? And what's its method of fighting likely to be like? So what does the French army look like on the very eve of war?
Oh, man. And here we're getting to the really fun stuff. We're getting into the red pants of the matter, I should say, which I'll save that's a whole rant for another time. But yes, the French army going into the First World War, August of 1914, very large force. Over the course of the war, 8.4 million Frenchmen are going to serve. And of those, 7.3 are already going to be in uniform by January of 1916. So the vast majority of French servicemen in the First World War will experience those first few months of the war. Of the army that's mobilized in 1914, 75% are going to be in the infantry. So a very, very weighted experience as well. But the basic organization of the French army under the Third Republic is shaped by the law of July 24th, 1873. And so within this law, you have metropolitan, so that's continental France again, being divided into 18 regions. By the time the war breaks out in 1914, you have 21. And each of these regions is going to become an army corps. So, for example, the 11th military region, which is going to be based at Nantes in Brittany, will end up forming the 11th Army Corps upon mobilization. And each of these military regions, later corps, are self-contained. And so arms, ammo, all the supply, transport, clothing, all within these corps. And interestingly, one that, again, we'll come back to is the 19th military region, which is Algeria. Again, considered part of metropolitan France, and these troops are going to show up at key points during the battles of the Marne. But by 1905, you have this law which stipulates mandatory all-male conscription for 2 years. So up until that point, not every man of qualifying age was called up. It was a lottery that happened at the beginning of every year, and there's lots and lots of exceptions. But starting that year in 1905, every man would receive a recruitment class, which is the year you turn 20. So, for example, if you were born in 1890, your class would be the class of 1910. You would also, if you so choose to make a career out of the military, I should add, because there are a few stories of this, your class would be whatever year you volunteered. So if you volunteer at 18 and you're born in 1890, you'd be a member of the class of 1908. you would join the army itself at 21. So there was a year in which, after you've been mobilized, that you were still among your family, you were still getting ready for that military service as well. But in case of a war, you were immediately going to be called up. And every class year, every soldier would report on the 1st of October of that year. So that was getting ready for the fall. The harvest is over. You would go and sign up. In 1913, they start the 3 years law. So that is saying now we're going to add an additional year. And this in itself causes a lot of scandal because this is felt like a more conservative push to grow the military at a time when there's lots of riots, there's lots of protests in France, unions. There's a famous wine protest in the south of France in Languedoc at this time that the army actually gets involved in, and a French regiment defects to the protesters. So that in itself, oh man, we got so many different episodes coming up, guys. But by 1913, and when we actually get into the First World War in 1914, the French army is operating under a 3 years law. And what that means, and these are the key numbers to remember, if you are a young man in France leading up to the First World War, means you're going to be doing 3 years of duty in the active army. And that means infantry regiment, artillery regiment, generally within your region, though they're going to try their best to make sure you're not in the town you're from. Key aspect there. After that, so you're now 23 years old, you get out. You got your certificate. You're no longer with the active army, but you owe the active reserve army 11 years. So you are still in the military. You're going to be drilling several times a month, similar to the British territorials, though not on a volunteer basis. And so that gets you to age 34. And you say, oh, I'm 34. Finally, my back's starting to really hurt. My legs start to hurt. I can't drink like I used to. But don't worry, you still have 7 more years to serve in the territorial army. So that gets you to 40. And you finally say, okay, I'm 40. I have a family now. I'm established. I can finally start to have my midlife crisis. But you still have 7 more years to serve in the Territorial Reserve Army. So all in all, you're going to be serving for 28 years in active or reserve functions. And that is almost universal. Very few exceptions. And I should point out as well, obviously, there are young gentlemen officers who serve as well in their mid-20s as lieutenants, as captains, and so on. They're still expected, even after attending their military academies, whether that's Saint-Cyr for the traditional combat arms, or the École Polytechnique for the engineers, for the artillery, for those more scientific arms. They're still serving at least a year as enlisted men in their regiments. So, for example, although this predates this law, Ferdinand Foch serves as an enlisted man before going and getting his full commission. And that is going to play a key aspect of how many French generals view the military as well. Almost all of them have served at least a year in the ranks, which is very different, I would think, than to the British military.
Well, just something that, as you were discussing about the duration of service, and something that the British Army is proud of and sees as a strength, and it is a strength, is the length of service that you have in the British Army. And you do get some lifers who will serve up for 25 years in the British Army. In a lot of the regiments, you wouldn't expect to see a sergeant until he'd had at least 12 years service. And so there's this expectation of long-term service. But one thing I'm glad you mentioned particularly territorial service, because something that really throws the British Army is, in Britain, territorial soldiers are generally fit young men who want to serve in the military part-time. A bit of adventure, a bit of fun, a little bit of extra money, often built around workplace or regional associations. And though the territorial army in Britain has its weaknesses, particularly its officer corps is quite old. It's often regulars who've decided to become territorials at the tail end of their career. Just you talking about, French territorials, all in their mid-30s and later, that's something that comes across quite strongly in a lot of British accounts when they encounter French territorials, that these are sort of older men with big grey moustaches and so on. And that is quite a length of service to serve in the French army. But I think that perhaps, and I'm conscious of time in this episode, there's so much more to cover in this series, I'm conscious of as well at the fact that the level of almost national mobilization that the French feel that they need to undertake to offset this potential military threat of Germany. Whereas in Britain, the army is there as an expeditionary force to go out to trouble spots, and the navy is the shield that protects Britain. France doesn't have that. It shares a land border with Germany, a country that had invaded it, of course, in 1870 with great success. And so I think you've done a great job, James, of outlining not only the organization of the French army, but also the psychology of the French army and the French government and tensions within it that aren't really mimicked in the other Allied powers, especially in Britain. And as we go through this, I think that's something we'll revisit time and again, that the French army is simply different in many pivotal respects to the British army, and indeed the American army, the Belgian army as well.
It is a drastically different experience. As I mentioned, over 8 million men mobilized. That's out of a population of about 19 million men in the entire country in 1914 over the course of the war. And unlike in Britain, unlike in the United States, where, you expect the 18 to the 30-year-olds to be carrying the burden as well. It's completely different in France and extended as well. As I mentioned, you're called up based on the year you turn 20. So those who had been born in 1894 are getting ready to be called up in 1914. But just to kind of put the numbers of the ages of the French soldiers in August 1914, because remember, I mentioned October 1st is the day you report. So in August of 1914, the classes of 1911 to 13 are doing their active service. And they're going to see the brunt of the fighting and the brunt of the casualties. If you want to talk about the myth of the lost generation, that would very much apply to the classes of 1911 to 1913 in France. So those are the 21 to 23-year-olds. The 24 to 34-year-olds are also called up. That's the classes of 1900 to 1910. And as well for the French territorial forces, which are supposed to augment the fighting forces. And then they'll be doing, unlike the British territorials, they'll be doing mostly rear area tasks. You mentioned the white mustaches. They're called the pépères in French, the jolly old uncles, because of their age. They're also going to be called up, and those are going to be the 35 to 38-year-olds in August of 1914, having done their service, I should say, between 1896 and 1899. They're all called up to do active duty, and at the height of the war, in March of 1916, they're going to be calling up the classes of 1886 to 1888. So those are the 48 to 50-year-olds. So there is a very large demographic of French men who are going to be called up to serve. And just because you're called up as a territorial to say, well, I'm 38, I'm calling up and I'm reporting to my territorial regiment, does not guarantee that once you get to that regiment, they're going to say, hey, we need drafts for the frontline infantry. And you're going to end up there. You're a trained infantryman. And so you will see men in their late 30s and early 40s serving in frontline French infantry regiments throughout the war. So a very, very different experience. And just like going the one way to drafting older and older men, of course, they're going to go younger and younger, just like the British do, just like the Germans do as well. So they're going to be drafting 18-year-olds in 1915. December of 1914, they're going to call up the class of 1915 early. All other classes up till 1919 get called up early. So this is how they're going to be quickly and rapidly sort of throwing men into the meat grinder that becomes the First World War. And as you'll see, it is dangerous business. 52% of all men who are mobilized in France are killed or wounded. 52%. 18% of them are going to be killed, which totals 4% of the French population as a whole. And there is a very large percentage of men who are wounded 2 or 3 times. So as we will see going into the war itself, it is a truly grueling business, but it's one that the entire male population and the whole nation is expected to carry the burden of.
Powerful numbers to bring this episode to an end. I think it's always powerful to kind of take a sobering look at those figures because, of course, the Great War for France is going to be astronomical in every sense of the word, and that is exactly where we're going to go with our very next episode. With the guns firing, we're going to take you to the front lines. We're going to look at perhaps the most pivotal action of 1914, perhaps the most pivotal action of the entire Great War, which is going to take us to the battles of the frontiers and the subsequent retreat right down to the Marne. But that's the end of our very first episode looking at the French army on the Western Front in the Great War. Hope you found it interesting. A big shout out just before we wrap up for today to those of you that have joined us on our brand new community hub, the Dugout, and come over and join Spence and I for the Q&A session and all of the new material we've got over there. We've already got a great community, really engaged. And bear in mind as well, if you want to come along and check it out, totally free of charge, there is a free 100% off promo code for 1 month's worth of free subscription to that service. So do come over, check it out, have a look, engage with Spence and I. James, I'm sure, will be in there as well to have a chat with us throughout this series. So lots of exciting things to come. But for the time being, thanks very much for joining us for this week, and we'll be back again to continue the story of the French in the Great War. You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon.
In this week's episode, alongside historian James Taub, actually, is it Taub or Taub, James?
It's Taub.
In this week's episode, alongside guest historian James Taub.
Can I just stop you there, Spence? That's hilarious because you just asked him how to pronounce his name, and then you totally disregarded it. So is it Taub or Taub? And he goes, "Oh, it's Taub." Okay, so here's James Taub.